Okay, welcome back. So we've just looked at some of the ways in which political divides can open up, particularly through in-group bias and the big sort on and offline. What can we do about that as change makers? Well, as with the last couple of weeks, we'll look at this in three categories. What happens at the I level, our own personal lives and thought processes, the we level, our immediate relationships with friends, family, in the workplace, and so on, and then the world level, how we design change-making strategies. And this week, we're going to start at the world level with 4 examples of really interesting and effective bridging strategies. The first one that I want to talk about is the way that with school strikers, you remember this was the school children who refused to go to school as a protest against climate change. And one of the ways it turned out that they were most effective in changing people's minds on climate change was through conversations with their own families. There's really strong evidence on this. And interestingly, it found that the school strikers often were most effective at changing the minds of family members when the school striker was a daughter and she was dealing with a white conservative father. So these are some of the people that are often hardest to reach for climate change campaigners. And yet, because their own children were starting from obviously a situation of relationship and very high trust, they were able to get through in ways that other activists were absolutely not. And this turned into quite a big impact across the school strikers as a whole. But what about in situations where you don't have a pre-existing relationship? Well, a second really interesting example is the field that's called deep canvassing in the United States. One of the originators of that field, and someone we've worked with in the past, is Dave Fleischer, who you see pictured here. Dave is an LGBT activist who works in Los Angeles. And when voters in California voted before equal marriage was legalized against a measure at the statewide level to allow gay marriage, Dave was really curious about why so many voters had voted against equal marriage. And so rather than kind of engaging in some of that calling out that we looked at before the break, Dave decided to go to some of the districts where these people lived, where there were very high concentrations of voters who voted against equal marriage, and just talk to them. And the approach he took was very much to try and build up a relationship. So he would start by showing respect in his approach. He would ask lots of open-ended questions and be very attentive to the answers that he got back. And all the time trying to create a kind of shared emotional ground, a sort of basis of empathy from which he could then invite people to reconsider their views. And again, there's a lot of interesting evidence to show that this is very effective, although it takes longer to do than traditional canvassing conversations. And we'll link to some of that evidence in this week's resources. So that's deep canvassing, our second example. The third really interesting example of bridging is where you have coalitions that include some really unusual participants, making them kind of instantly surprising and newsworthy. And one of our favorite examples of this was a campaign put together by 3 environmental groups, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, and Platform, who wanted to run a big campaign on the UK's offshore oil and gas sector. But they realized early on that a potentially powerful source of opposition might come from oil sector workers who would see this as a threat to their livelihoods. So what they did, interestingly, was before the campaign even began, go out of their way to create relationships with the oil workers, to kind of create lots of conversations and build that basis of trust. And the result, fantastically, was this joint campaign, which included the environmental NGOs and oil sector workers who'd managed to find enough common ground that they could put together a shared campaign against the oil companies to push for a kind of just transition away from offshore oil and gas. Very effective campaign, much more newsworthy than if it had just been those 3 environmental organizations on their own. And one last example that we love talking about is the Radical Love campaign that happened in Istanbul in 2019. Now, the story here was that there was an election for the mayoralty of the city, and it took place between 2 parties, the AKP party, which was President Erdogan's predominantly Islamist party, and then the more moderate secular CHP party. Now, the CH party won the election narrowly in March of 2019. But what happened then was that President Erdogan used his influence over the courts to have the result annulled. Now, a lot of CHP supporters were furious and wanted to kind of go out and noisily protest. But their leader, a man called Ekrem İmamoğlu, saw the trap that was being laid for them, this attempt to kind of bait them into a culture war, to ignite their fury in ways that would have really fired up the AKP's political base through exactly that dynamic of mutual radicalization that I touched on before the break. So rather than walk into that trap, İmamoğlu oversaw this approach, this strategy that was called radical love. And it rested on really going out of their way to show respect to AKP voters. So, for example, İmamoğlu spent a lot of time in the election campaign touring mosques, one of the real power bases for President Erdogan. He made a point of kind of hugging opponents in the street, for example. Very good TV. And they spent a lot of time training their activists to keep their cool, to not trigger and start shouting if an AKP supporter was getting in their face at a street stall, but to stay calm, because that was their way of defusing the encounter. And the result of this was that when the rerun election took place in June that year, the CHP won by a landslide. It was a very, very effective campaign, based again on kind of really emphasizing this theme of relationship and common identity. So what's going on in all of these examples at the we level? Well, in order to create and sustain relationship, we're really interested in the idea of so-called courageous conversations, which, as the poet David Whyte here observes, are often the ones that we don't want to have, that we kind of shy away from because they're difficult or challenging. Now, one person who's a real pioneer in this space is Professor Loretta Ross, who teaches at a university in America. And she's really kind of trailblazed this whole approach of, rather than calling people out, so publicly shaming them, for example, calling them in instead. So there's still a holding to account, but rather than public shaming, there's a kind of relationship, a conversation, a kind of frank discussion, but that still rests on that sense of relationship. And a really kind of extreme and very inspiring example of this is the work of a man called Daryl Davis, who's an African-American musician who in his spare time attends KKK rallies and befriends the white supremacists that he meets there, creates again that kind of shared emotional common ground in the process, very much like Dave Fleischer, the LGBT campaigner, does. But in Daryl's case, what he does is actually talk them out of being white supremacists. And more than 200 people have left the KKK as a result of being befriended by Daryl. So that's an example to show that even in situations as extreme as that, it's still possible for these courageous conversations to work. So what finally is going on at the I level in order to be able to do this? Well, one aspect of it is the stuff we touched on in week 2, defusing, untriggering ourselves so that we're getting out of that fight, flight, freeze response that we can easily lapse into when we come face to face with the other, and instead to kind of stay cool and be able to choose consciously how to respond. That's very much a precondition to be able to have these courageous conversations, and one that the CHP emphasized enormously in the Radical Love campaign. But the other key skill here, and one that we'll be putting some resources about in this week's pack, is perspective taking. And this is the whole approach of being able to put ourselves in other people's shoes, or to be able to kind of see the world through their lenses and see how their experiences, their upbringing might have led them to the perspectives that they have, which isn't to say that we're saying those perspectives are correct or that even they're necessarily legitimate. But it is this ability to see the world through other people's eyes, because that's such an important precondition of being able to have these respectful, courageous conversations that find emotional common ground. So that's it. Look forward to seeing you next week.